Good morning, good morning. Oh, I'm getting a little feedback on the laptop. Can you hear me okay? Kish, is there anything I can do just on the laptop to... Right. Testing, testing? No.
It's all off, isn't it?
I thought so.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll give it a go. I think there's something very odd with this laptop. I've muted the microphone, but things are still coming out. I can't hear you, Kish, I'm afraid. I've done that. That's. Oh, I thought it's muted. It's completely muted.
Could it be the actual microphone?
I'm going to give it a go with that. But maybe someone who's IT savvy. Thomas, do you mind coming down and sorting out the laptop while I talk? Now I'm going to be... this is mainly for the people in the room. We've got a few people online. Hello and welcome. A few housekeeping things. We don't have any fire alarms planned, so if it goes off, please exit the building carefully. Secondly, we are going to be taking some photos today, randomly. So if you don't want your photo taken, please let Saskia know, because obviously we haven't got any consent forms and things like that. But okay, thank you, John. And lastly, we're going to have some roving microphones going around the room. There are people joining online. We're also recording today. And so if you have a question, please wait for the microphone to come to you. And if you're online, please post any questions in the chat and we'll read them out rather than asking you to speak, because I've set quite close times as well. Great. So if we just have my... Fabulous. So welcome, thank you again. This is the fourth time we've met as a group, as an HMDS network, and you know the aims. We're bringing people together to try and help our patients, essentially, but the way we do that is by working on specific projects, but also working together and with other stakeholders as well. So I work down the road in a siHMDS, and I'm very grateful for those of you who have come from very far to join us today. I'd also really like to thank the British Society of Haematology, who have kindly funded today's meeting, and we're very grateful for them. Also very grateful to the BSH team, in particular Thomas today, who's done all the hard work to coordinate, along with Saskia, but also Anne O'Connor, who's no longer working with the BSH, but helped to set up this meeting and has helped to set up meetings in the past. Also to the Lab SIG committee, chaired by April Sellers, who have helped coordinate today. Thank you to the speakers and to the organisations that you represent for joining us today. And thank you to the lab leads who are coming. You may be a speaker, but also just thank you for coming today and participating. So this is just a visual summary of the HMDS network. It's a loose federation of the laboratories brought together, 25 of them across the UK, as far as we can tell, and also working with other national organisations on various projects. So that's a kind of visual description of who we are. These are the people who signed up to come today. We've got about 80 or so people joined face-to-face, hopefully. There will be a few more people online as well. We're recording it so other people can watch afterwards, and we'll be sharing the presentations from today as well. But we've got people from most places in the UK. Some places are further away than others that haven't managed to make it, but we've got quite a few there. Now, we are representing all of the HMDS labs in the United Kingdom. That includes the devolved nations. The Royal College represents the entire UK. The British Society of Haematology, the British Lymphoma Pathology Group represent the whole UK. There are genomics commissioners in the devolved nations, but also NHS England are here as well. So we are a network for the entire country, not just for England, not just for London, but we are trying to represent people. So we need to work harder to make sure that everyone can access the highest quality diagnostics they can, wherever they are. And this comes on to the patient. So if this was you or your loved one, these are slides I presented last year as well, but on the right-hand side is someone who really didn't access a high-quality siHMDS at all, and they ended up with the wrong diagnosis, ended up relapsing. Now, unfortunately, we're probably very familiar with that. On the left-hand side is what we aspire to and what most of us are delivering, but we could all do a bit better. Now, this is a picture of Everest. There are different routes up, and if you're a patient, some of those routes are less safe than others. So there are different routes to the top of the mountain. We don't all have to do it the same way. We have to make sure it's locally adapted, make sure it's flexible, but we all are trying to get to the top of the mountain. Now, unfortunately, in HMDS world, we don't know where the top of the mountain always is, though we have guidelines to say that. So we talked a lot last year about how we know when we're reaching the top. I talked last year about the future. We are pioneering a lot of treatment. So blood cancer is really common when you add them all up. I know there's a lot of diversity within blood cancer, but it will affect a lot of people, particularly with kids, but also as you get older. And one of the things to improve the outcomes for patients is clear in NG47 is we improve the diagnostics. There's no point in spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on monoclonal antibodies, stem cell transplants, if you got the diagnosis wrong in the first place. So improving the diagnosis at the beginning with a few hundred or a few thousand quid is the way to do it. And hematopathology and hematology in this SIHMDS have really pioneered precision medicine for medicine. We are the pioneers of this. We have implemented genomics into mainstream pathology. In my GMS, about 50% of all the genomics in the GMS commissioned is hem-onc genomics. We are really at the cutting edge of things. We are the experts in genomics, but also precision medicine. So super specialization, if you're a patient, is a really good thing. That means you get the highest personalized therapy, but actually it makes things really challenging and actually creates almost a workforce problem. And we'll talk about that a bit later. So we have a duty to work together to kind of address these things, keep on innovating, but also spread those innovations to make sure we harmonize as well. Just a couple of brief slides. I talked about this last year. We've got lucky. There's something about leukemias and blood cancers that are a bit simpler. We can obviously access the tissue and study it. We've pioneered both cancer study and inherited disease study as well with genomics as well. And one of the other benefits, we're both pathologists and physicians, if you're a hematologist, but I include hematopathologists in this, and the therapies have changed, that we actually can now have therapies that our diagnostics can actually influence as well. Integrated diagnostics, of course, is the cornerstone of what we do. This is another visualization of NG47. Evidence in the past has shown that if you don't do this, you get it wrong, you give the patient the wrong diagnosis, you miss cancers. And this is a real model which we're all striving for. Now, a lot of the conversation we've had over the past few years about appetite for peer review, are we all meeting NG47? And that's still important. We've talked about that before, about whether all the labs are achieving that. More important for me is whether all patients are actually accessing an HMDS lab at all, because if they aren't, then there's no point in having a compliant lab if they're not reaching it. There are many challenges to integrated diagnostics. So first of all, to build that co-located laboratory takes a lot of money, a lot of investment. And also, spreading things across the country is locally flexible and has many benefits, but actually makes things harder, more expensive, possibly lower quality. Now, one of the things I find, I go around the country, I speak to histopathologists, hematologists, I speak to NHS England, I speak to the Royal College of Pathologists. Everyone speaks a slightly different language. They think they're speaking the same language, but they actually see the world in a really different way. And that's really interesting because that's what generates the diversity that drives innovation. There's kind of conversations where people challenge each other, challenge their assumptions, but also leads to conflict and misunderstanding and miscommunication because people are fundamentally talking about different things and have different priorities, partly based on their professional or cultural background or what they're trying to achieve. Of course, patients are very inconsiderate and don't present via the standard route. So a few more challenges. So first of all, with hemato-oncology diagnostics is largely based, a lot of it, on genomics now, and we have advanced that, but they need to get faster and faster. Those urgent tests now include tests which you can only do via NGS panel. So it used to be NPM1 FLT3, but now we need to do IDH, we need to do TP53, we need KMT2A, fusions, etc., and that's not to mention FISH. So you need your rapid testing via NGS panels on site within 3 days nowadays. That's modern diagnostics. Similarly, you can't have FISH in a different place from your non-urgent cytogenetics, it's the same workforce, and it's the same precious scientific workforce that reports your cytogenetics and your genomics. And ultimately, as WGS find its place, they're going to be reporting that as well. So the pressure is to do things more urgently. There are quite a lot of concerns around genomics. So we've, since 2018, many of you shared concerns about the model that was built then, and surveys, we presented this group as well, have shown large concerns over genomics. Most of the HMDS labs in the country don't feel that genomic reconfiguration has helped them and their patients. And it's ended up in a situation where many labs, most labs, have said they oppose the model as it is. And we need to address that, and that's what we've been trying to do as well. And many of you, most of you, don't think that the model as proposed by the genomics unit is actually compatible with NG47, and it's not going to work, partly because of those urgent tests, but also about the IT, the workforce, and things like that. And just to go back, and one of the reasons, as I've learned, is that the model back in 2018 was based on how do we get WGS into mainstream pathology, and that's a noble aim, but it's hard, and it's still not quite there yet, but that's still an aspiration, and a consolidated model was thought to be the way to do it. The other idea was it would save money. What I've come to learn is that idea back from 2018, the model that's been designed wasn't designed by scientific or clinical experts. It wasn't designed in conjunction with the HMDS leads, and the GLH scientific and clinical leads have said that they really didn't design that model, they've just been asked to implement it. So they found themselves in a very difficult position whereby we've got a model that was proposed that the GLH scientific and clinical leads don't really believe in, didn't design, and wasn't designed with the HMDS, but it was designed with good intentions, but it's not really a modern model, and we're trying to work with that. So that led to last year, because of the contracting changes, several letters written by various national organisations to say, look, we're really concerned about this model. We feel we're not being listened to. We feel this isn't right for patients. We need to talk about this. And I think, again, people speaking different languages, people afraid of challenge, people afraid of engagement, that's not the way to go. And that's what today is about. People speaking to each other, learning each other's languages, and making sure we develop the best model for patients. And that's, we'll talk about genomics a bit later on, about how we're trying to resolve that. Let's come back to the positives, because genomics has been a distraction, unfortunately. What we talked about last year was what projects can we take forward to improve things. So the future's already here, but we don't all agree on what exactly the evidence is, what we should be doing, what the consensus is. So what we talked about last year is less of a focus on peer review, because actually that's quite challenging, anxiety-inducing, let alone expensive, but what projects can we do together, sharing each other, the learning with each other. And we decided to focus on qualitative methodology, because we're not going to have randomized controlled trials in this realm. So we talked about, that's about telling a story, making sure we set some standards, but also think about the research that we need to plan in the future, and using that qualitative methodology. So what we agreed last year, believe it or not, the people who were here last year, you agreed to a 3-year strategy. So this is year 1, and we're presenting the outcomes of that. What we agreed to do is to try and set up some groups to enable a flow cytometry network. We'll hear about that. To talk about what integrated reporting means, because it means different things to different people. We wanted to make sure histopathology voice was heard. We were talking about the various EQA schemes, so we're going to talk about that today. And we were really worried about workforce. So we didn't get a chance to talk about scientific workforce, but we will do that this year. We had a really good session on medical workforce, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. So certain things we didn't actually achieve, but today is about the outputs of all of that. And then thinking about what we do this year, next year, and going forward to keep this momentum up. And these are just some of the ideas we had last year. They're not necessarily the ones we want to carry forward, but they're still good aspirations. So this is what we're going to talk about today. And initially, we're going to focus on integrated reporting and think about EQA in the morning, and then talk about other things in the afternoon. I've not left much time for breaks and things, but we'll try and work with that. So please join in, please engage, please try and learn each other's languages, and say hello to each other, because one of the powers of today, a face-to-face meeting, is getting to know each other, but also start thinking and feedback to me either at the end of the day in the breaks about what we do next. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to John and Luke.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I suspect we're going to get feedback again. How's it sounding? We're all right? Okay, good. Right, I shall move on then. Right, so I'm reporting about specialist integrated reporting. Before I start, you'll see there's a Slido QR code and login there. I'm inviting people to do some live voting later on because this is an interactive meeting and I would like to get opinions. So I can see lots of phones going up. For those people who prefer a text-based method, there is a login and a password. This will appear later on slides as well, so if you don't get on straight away, that's fine. The QR code is on each slide, but you don't need to separately log in. Once you're in, all right? So without further ado, my problem with doing this was, where do we start? What questions do we ask? What do we need to know? So also, I'm aware that Ash is giving a report directly after mine, which deals with some of the same areas, and that is great because it means I don't have to say some of the things I didn't want to. So I've seen Ash's proposal, and I believe we are mutually reinforcing. So just to review, the siHMDSs were generated originally from a document in 2003, which was a framework, which is the framework we still use now. All right, that's more than 20 years ago. The framework for what we do was invented. It was updated just under 10 years ago in 2016. Point about the 2016 was it more or less mandated it. It gave a funding stream and expectation. And I think while there were many existing units in place at that time, the updated guidance really gave the impetus that now puts us in the situation we are now, where there's an expectation to provide that service. The final combined reporting is not the sole element, but it is a very important element of that. It's a report that unifies everything we do. It will vary from case to case what exactly everything is, but the conception is if there's more than one investigation, then it's all integrated into a final report. It was based on evidence, all right? The diagnosis was improved, and this was mainly from lymphoma work, where the diagnosis was made in a central service where expertise was co-located. For those people who weren't around at the time when this first came up, it was controversial. People worried for various reasons. Some of it was personal. They didn't want to lose control over their own diagnosis. Haematologists at that time and pathologists were used to making diagnosis in their own hospital and felt that was being taken away from them. It was partly perceived as a risk that as soon as this happened, people would be de-skilled and that the focus of skills would be placed in central areas and that would be a problem. It was also partly structural. In many cases, there was no agreement on who should provide it, and many people will be aware of quite bitter local disputes as to how this was implemented. But we are now at a situation where it is more generally in place since the NG47 guidance. However, we all grew up separately. We all work in separate environments with separate skills, separate designs, and so we do it differently. And I'm conscious that any change to what we do isn't always easy for one unit to be in place. I can say this will be great and easy in Manchester, and someone else will say the structure of the way we report makes this impossible in Hospital X. All right, so we do need to be aware that any suggestions are based on where we're located, how we work, and equally, and possibly more important, how our IT system works. There are downsides. I think I am now seeing a reduced diagnostic confidence and knowledge amongst the clinicians we serve. When I put a report, I'm far less confident that anyone knows what I'm talking about. That does come up, all right? Increasingly, also, expectations are changing. As people lose confidence in their ability to know what a molecular test or a cytogenetic test means, they're relying increasingly on us to explain it, and sometimes to very specifically point it out to them. If it has a MRD implication or a treatment implication, people want to be told that in a way they didn't previously. So, how is the nature of reporting changing? This will begin to sound old. Luke told me he gets embarrassed when not embarrassed, but confused when I point out detailed information about red cell morphology instead of simply asking for a panel. I'm conscious I am a dinosaur now. I like looking at cells. But this is a general feeling. Molecular and cytogenetics are changing the way we work. They are now far more important. I've even reached a stage where I often won't confidently diagnose MDS until I've seen the genetics. Complexity, the WHO and ICC debacle, if I'm allowed to say that, has meant everything is much more complex, all right? There are many, many more demands on us, not just for the scientific information, integration of tests, but also our interaction with clinicians, because we need the information from the patient in a way that previously maybe we'd have waited for an MDT. You can't diagnose CMML without knowing the monocyte count. If they don't tell you, you don't get it. Timing, tests take longer. Often people are starting their treatments before we have a final combined diagnosis for them. Should we be telling them beforehand what we think? Treatment options are expanding, often dictated by genetic lesions. How do we communicate that with people? Do we expect them to find out, or do we specifically tell them? Prognostic scores and MRD assessments, increasingly important. We are the people often with that information, or at least part of that information. How much of our responsibility is it to communicate that? And finally, the reporting of follow-up samples is now becoming much more standardized. That's important for clinical trials and evaluation, should we be providing that information. So I think that we in the NHS are lucky to have this structure. It's not been routinely applied worldwide. It's very much a UK thing, or largely a UK thing. It gives us a structure that's provided equity. Our reports reach all hospitals irrespective of the skills in that department. So a district general hospital receives a report in the same way as a central teaching hospital. So we can provide the information in an equitable way, and Tom's very much part of one of his slides was equity. And also we have the information and the expertise. We can no longer rely on our clinicians to have that. So preaching done. Increasingly clinicians are having a difficult time. I believe we should be providing more help. What I don't believe we necessarily can. The question we have to ask ourselves is, do we need to envisage our role? What are our priorities? And do we have resources? And can it be resourced? So what I found out, I did some structured interviews with many of you. If I forgot you and you emailed me, I'm really sorry. I'm hopeless with email. They get lost in trails and I forget. But I'm very grateful for those people I did interview with. And what I found out is just two things, really, essentially. I've told people I'm not going to quote individual practice, and I won't. But what I did find out is we are not all the same. We do it in very different ways. Our structures are very different, and they're imposed upon us. Some places have the luxury of having it all in one place. Other people bit it together from sites within hospitals. Others coordinate across multiple hospitals. Increasing with MRD and the like, we're doing it from hospitals that are remote from ourselves. In some cases, it's transactional. In some cases, it's part of our specialist services. We have semi-detached hospitals who still refuse to send us all their samples or give us all their information. And the user base we serve varies from MDT to MDT. So we cannot rely on what a one-shape-fits-all very easily. Secondly, IT is hugely important. There are different models. There is a use-your-own IT system, construct a report, and send a report out to your users. That's very frequent and can work really well. Patients are booked in nicely under their own NHS numbers. It works very well at the front end. However, sometimes it's more difficult to serve your outreach people. What is included in the report Ash is going to deal with, and I'm not going to really particularly go into detail, but we do vary in what we include. Sometimes there's a lot of information, sometimes there's a summary. When is it final? We know that lots of tests take a long time. Sometimes waiting for a final report can take many weeks. Some people give out a provisional report, others don't. So I'm interested in what people think about the minimal clinically important report. Who signs it off? Some reports are simple. They've been produced in multiple labs, been quality checked in multiple labs. One person could sign it off. Some are more complex, undoubtedly need discussion, and they're intermediate reports. Some people do double sign-offs. Some people are happy with single sign-offs, and some people do that mandated according to a proper protocol of what's suitable for each case. The last one's clearly the most defensible. The single sign-off's the easiest, but again, it varies. Also, no consistency over MRD treatment recommendations. Most people will point out an NPM1. The more sophisticated, detailed analysis isn't always there. And mandated information. I have hospitals who write AML on any referral. All right? It doesn't really indicate what they've got, and we then have to judge it. Okay? If you look at your sample before you send it to the labs, that's great. But in our case, because we're getting samples of parents all hours of the day, through different routes and different hospitals, we have to pathway it. And that means that people end into wrong pathways, and we spend half our time repairing misdiagnoses or missed clinical informations. So my questions, and this is going to be a set of interactive questions which you'll be happy to move on to because I can be quiet, is when does report integration begin? Do we begin to integrate to give an interim report, a minimum treatment guidance, or do we allow our clinicians to make those decisions? What should a report look like? What are we trying to communicate? I've always been a great fan of giving them everything, but I've increasingly realised that confuses people. When should integration stop? What else should we provide? Should it be MRD? Should it be treatment? How do we do it if we do it? And can we identify workload implications? Our work has got increasingly complicated. Our staff have not increased. Do we need formal workload? The sort of histopathologists use very well to determine who should do what, and how do we calculate it in a situation where the integration is becoming increasingly complex? So, your turn. So, a few questions. Oops. Try that again. Should clinical information be mandated? Should our users receive referral standards? We operate to standards. Should we expect them? Is it acceptable that people can just send us AML for every question or send a sample on a myeloma pathway when they think it's really an MDS? Okay, should this be something we actually focus our attention on? And I can see there seems to be a fairly strong happiness response to this one. I think it's perfect. How we do it, how we mandate it, how we do it. I just wanted to get an idea, all right? Next question. The ICDO code, all right? Ash, this is for you. Resource implications, resource communications, all depending on coding your diagnosis properly and communicating to central sites, all right? Many people code it, many people do not. That information does allow health service planning. Is it part of our role to ensure we do that? I appreciate there's a workload implication. People potentially need to stare at lists. What do we think? I'm just going to let you talk. But you remember, you can change your mind if you want to. You can edit your response back. So, but yeah, okay, so a slightly less enthusiasm there, and certainly more variable response. I appreciate we're a mixed audience, by the way. People have different views. Formal sign-off guidance. Are we all happy with what we do? The double sign-off that a lot of people use, sorry, this is a word cloud, I think, is that right, Luke? It's a word cloud, you can type. I know a lot of people, so just type your response, hit enter, and it'll appear on the screen. If you want to upregulate someone else's response, just type exactly what they said. It's easy to say everyone's a double sign-off. It works, however, it's time intensive. It's also easy to say for complex cases, we do it at an MDT, or we do it in a diagnostic meeting, or we get a colleague to look at it. But should that be formalized? Do we need to know how it works? What is our preferred model? Wow, this is the problem of the word cloud. The bigger it is, the more important it's considered. However, there is obviously a lot of different views here. Double sign-off is easy to type in, is coming up a lot, but there's a lot of alternative views going in the background. So again, I think this is something we should think about. It does have workload implications. I don't want to stand up in court saying, no, I chose not to double sign it, so I didn't think it should do. But as a set of guidance that told me it's perfectly reasonable to do that, I feel more confident. Wow, I'll look at those later. Thank you. Okay. Treatment relevant information. Should we highlight this in a structured way? I'm conscious that if you get an NPM1 or a FLT3 or an increasing in IDH1, it's in your report. The clinician can read it. Should we tell them? The reason I ask this is we were recently asked by one of our trusts to highlight ADH1 because they had a trial opening. And could we tell them whenever we got it and highlight it on the report? I said immediately no, because that's not equitable. Not everyone has access to that trial. If we're going to do it, we have to do it for everyone. And we're running a little pilot test to provide it for everyone, and I think that's going to get complicated. But do we need a way of doing it? Should it be done? Bear in mind, by voting yes, you're putting it on the agenda for future action. Should we provide follow-up reporting in a structured way? This is for trials. Trials now do expect us to say how we diagnosed remission. Was it remission with blood counts fully returned? Or was it some partial remission? Are we operating on a sample that is so rubbish to say anything at all? Okay, do we need to institute those rules? There's guidance come out recently. Should we be adopting it in our reports? Hopefully you're voting on what you think will help patients rather than what you think is easy to put in your own institution, because I don't want to do it, but I can see it's valuable, so I will. So again, interesting. I think the less popular scores are going out to about 50% with a yes, but yes is always most popular because he's such a nice group of people. Interim reports. This is a lot more contentious. So our users now expect interim reports. They expect to be told early on if we've got a TP53 mutation, likely poor prognosis AML. Let's go for a good biphasic result here, I think. Should we do it? It is difficult, I appreciate. There are some IT systems that really make it very, very difficult. If you do it for your hospital IT and you want to put an interim and then change it, that can be tricky. It doesn't mean to say it's not an aspiration, but I do appreciate it's not necessarily the simplest thing in the world to do from the way people operate. And that's what did come out from the way I was talking, that to talking to people, people mostly do what's easy, because what is hard can be very, very, very hard. That's interesting. That's the most balanced one yet. I like that. Prognostic scores, our responsibility or not. Easy to say clinicians do it. Our clinicians often do it very badly. Okay, I'm getting a feel for this one. It's always nice to know that you can, you can say no. Good, okay. Structured, personalised MRD advice. Now, in contrast to treatment, this is often a lot more difficult because we are the people who get those results. We're the people who do the tests. We know it's available. We know where to send them. All right. If we ask clinician in hospital X who may not have any expertise in the matter to do it themselves, the chances are they won't. If someone gets a wrong MRD advice, then their care can be very, very substantially disrupted. So I think personally, I didn't introduce this innovation to our trust. Luke insisted we did it. But I think it's right personally, but I can see, again, not necessarily strong consensus on this one. Finally, resource modelling requirements. If I go to my hospital and say I need more staff, they will say to me, how do we know? What are your hours? What's your hours? It comes from histopath. People are very used to it, and histopathologists, and the histopathologist sitting here looking at me and thinking, why on earth am I asking the question? But for haematologists, it's not easy. How do we coordinate the time taken for a complex MDT, a complex sign-off, a double sign-off, a single sign-off, a reporter with one sample, reporting with 10 samples? What do we do? Do we need a model? Clearly not. Sorry, clearly yes. Finally, any other thoughts or feelings? This is a millennial presentation. Now we need to consider feelings as well as thoughts. So can we, anything you want to say it now. It'll be recorded forever. I think that probably works quite well, actually. I can't see anyone actively typing at this moment. So I'll just give you a second more before I steal time for the next presentation. But thank you very much. This is essentially food for thought. I can see Tom signalling, so.
Do you want to offer people the ability to comment or ask questions? You've got about 10 minutes before we're due for next.
Okay, I'm going to offer the opportunity for people to comment or ask questions briefly, succinctly, in a time-orientated sort of way, okay?
If you put your hand up, a roving mic will be with you in a second.
So that wasn't meant to put people off. I'm not trying to guilt anyone into not asking questions. One question I have asked for people is anyone interested in a formal workshop to discuss this as a next step, or do you think a formal questionnaire going out will be a better approach? Can I have a quick show of hands for nothing? Questionnaire? Workshop? Okay, so questionnaire as the next step seems to have slightly more votes, but we can look at a workshop thereafter once we've got the questionnaire to discuss. Okay, sorry.
John, question for me. I'm conscious that we're kind of in a room of diagnosticians. Do you think we should probably ask these questions to the clinicians as well? Because I feel like we might be voting with quite a strong bias, and perhaps they will have perhaps counter opinions on MRD or prognostics?
The answer to that is undoubtedly yes. Whether we'll get the answers we want, the clinicians always want everything you can give them free and as soon as possible. So we do have to be a little bit careful we know what we're offering before we offer it. But yes, I think probably a sensible clinician input would be good.
Peter Johnston from Aberdeen. It's just to pick up the point about a workload guidance. Histo certainly does have that. Just a word of caution, however, it has taken us 6 years from the time of the last review to be able to produce a further review because it is so contentious. And the danger of is it's used against us rather than for us, because whilst it can be used as a way of regulating the amount of work that people need to do, it's also regulating us to do as much work as people think we should be doing. And so it's a two-sided sword, and just be careful with it and how it's implemented, because it does depend hugely on the people that you've got, the amount of capacity that you have in a department, and the environment within that department, which enables it, which includes all sorts of things like LIMS systems which don't work, and labs that don't have kit, and all sorts of other things, staffing issues that are all relevant. So just a word of caution about that before we go down that rabbit hole too swiftly, I would suggest.
Okay, thank you. I have nothing to add to that comment because it's all correct, accurate, and I agree. So, yeah.
I have a question, if you don't mind. So what I'd love as an output of this is a written summary of what the consensus is in the country from the experts, almost leading towards a recommendation, a guideline, recognising there's no evidence base. So it's interesting, when answering a lot of your questions in the poll, I was trying to struggle between what the current reality is, what's achievable now, versus what actually ideally I'd love to have if I had the resources and the IT. So I was kind of torn sometimes. Yes, it would be great if we could provide a prognostic score, but actually I don't think that's something we can really achieve at the moment. So it'd be interesting to see what comes as an output from this in terms of recommending what's the ideal versus recognising what people currently think they can deliver and recognise that difference.
Yeah, absolutely taken on board. In the structured interviews, I did say to people, what do you do? What would you like to do? And it was clear there's the difference. We are constrained, as I said earlier, IT, etc. Things seem very hard. It doesn't mean to say they can't be aspirational, but some things do seem very hard. I have to sort of do a slight admission of interest in this because we're going to show an IT system shortly, an AI system shortly that does potentially answer some of these questions. And now might be a good time, folks. Can hand over to Luke, really, if everyone's okay. There's some more questions. I don't want to get, again, I'm conscious of sort of controlling your responses here.
We got one question over here. So I'll just pass it over.
Sorry, thank you for that. I think we should maybe go back to the question about asking the referrers exactly what they need, because as someone said, you know, we're all working diagnostics here. We're going to say what we think we can deliver, but if that's not joined up with what they absolutely need, and the other to address the point from the gentleman from Aberdeen is, yes, there is a big difference in what labs have, but if we can identify what a baseline should look like, then you identify what labs can and can't do. You can then start to make cases for getting that technology, for getting that equipment, for getting those resources you need. And also, if you've got someone who's not doing as much as everyone else, then that's useful to be able to hold them to account, which ultimately we are a service provision, which a lot of people don't like to think of it as, but we have customers. So I think benchmarking ourselves and holding ourselves accountable to those standards is important.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, we're going to move off this subject to something far less contentious, which is the role of AI in diagnosis. So I'm going to start off with a whole series of kind of pseudo disclaimers. So I'm going to talk for 5 minutes, then hand over to Luke, hopefully having padded you out with the fact that we are only partial believers.
Just going back onto Teams, because apparently the folk can't see the presentation on Teams. So we may start the feed.
Okay, to those who just joined us on Teams, I apologise. You didn't get to see the last presentation or indeed make your opinions known, but it will be shareable to you. Oh.
Share on Teams.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Stop sharing, try again. Gotta love Teams. Oh,
Yep.
good,
All
excellent.
good. All right, great. There you go.
Right. Okay. Apologies again for the people on Teams. At least you didn't have to get up early to travel. So we're going to talk now about the use of AI in integrated reporting. I'm here. I'm the second person down. Luke is next to me. He's on the top. We're both diagnosticians. We have been essentially responsible for looking over what someone else did and saying what was and was not a good idea and what we'd like to see. The two people implementing them is Robbie Lee and Danny Clarke. They've known each other since being at school. I've known Robbie since he was born. And I've known Luke for quite a few years now. So we are basically a consistent team. We're not employing each other. We're all engaged in this. Now, page down, page up is going to look interesting. Okay. So what are the problems and what are the opportunities? I'm just going to give a very brief slide because you all know this. Decision making, and I'm focused on myeloid malignancies here, but it's extending to all forms of malignancy, is increasingly complex, time-consuming, and difficult. By difficult, if you just look at the little bit at the bottom, you can see the AML, the WHO and the ICC offer respectively 29 and 52 baseline AML types. By the time you add on essential qualifiers, you get up to 2,088 and 3,744 respectively. Some are mutually exclusive, so the numbers are slightly smaller than that, but it gives you an idea of scale. Potential for error of different levels, admittedly, is therefore high. Advances in AI offer substantial opportunities for support, but there are risks, and what we don't want to see is uncontrolled implementation that doesn't take account of those risks. Some people say, why not use a large language model, such as an LLM, such as ChatGPT, to report? I had an interesting discussion with Ash about this earlier, we have the same experience. Problem, LLMs are simply really good text predictors. I won't go into all the details about them. I'm happy to bore anyone with it for several hours, I'll request. They're a black box. Not only do they not tell you how they get to their answer, they cannot tell you how to get their answer. If you ask them, they'll justify it, but they don't know how they got there. They're just providing a post hoc justification. They hallucinate. Hallucination's a nice term. It means they get it wrong. All right? They're designed to be creative. A larger ChatGPT, one of its points about it is it creates things. In order to create things, it has to have errors. All right? It has to have randomness pre-programmed in. To quote Sam Altman, the public just have to learn that sometimes it gets things wrong. All right? No way around. That's the architecture. We can't get rid of it. We can train on bigger training sets that get a bit better, but training sets are now 70% of the internet, so we're not going to see any big improvements. Equally, the randomness that's pre-programmed into these systems means the answer to the same question can differ. All right? So all these things mean where we require accurate, reproducible, and transparent answers, i.e. diagnosis, they're rubbish. But are they rubbish? Well, no, because the one thing they're very, very good at is extracting specific data. It's part of the token system, the way they recognize texts and the way they recognize relationships between different texts. If you ask them, is this item of data in the report, they can find it, and they can reproduce it quite reliably. So what we've tried to do is extract that data extraction using an LLM, and we believe it's actually very, very reliable, but then put it into a rule-based algorithm to classify it, because that's all classifications are, rule-based algorithms. All right, so we can harness a rule-based algorithm, we avoid hallucination, we avoid the variability. It's not a black box because we can install transparency. We also have the opportunity to value human conclusions. The human conclusion can be extracted by LLM and compared against the outputs. That means the reports we write are a check for the LLM's outputs, all right? We're not ignoring diagnosticians, they're highly valued. If there's a difference between what the clinician says and the algorithm says, that can be queried. And why can it be queried? Because everything's expectable. Again, Luke will show you shortly, we're able to inspect where everything came from. And finally, regulatory validation. Never heard and realised anything about this, but it's actually quite good for us. We're now employing industry standard testing for algorithm coherence, which is mathematical models, apparently, and data reproducibility, which means testing the same data set over thousands of times to make sure there's no differences. And I'm saying it's looking quite good so far. What's our scope of coverage at the moment? We think we can classify AML, according to WHO and ICC, reliably, and MDS, according to WHO and ICC, reliably. We can generate prognostic scores, and there are many, many ways to take this forward. Again, anyone wants to speak to me afterwards about the many, many ways we think we can take it forward, I can tell them. So, a demo. Luke's turn.
Cool, thanks, John. So very good of you to give me the hospital pass of the live demonstration. That's much appreciated. What I'm going to show you, because sometimes it's a little bit intangible exactly what these things are and what we're talking about. So I'd just like to give you a little bit of a demonstration. I'll just make the teams a wee bit smaller of exactly kind of what the model looks like. So we've got about kind of 10 or 15 minutes just to kind of to zip you through. So we have different kind of modules as part of our platform. Some of them are more developed than others, but we think our classification system for both AML and for MDS is actually a pretty advanced stage, and we've done quite a lot of practice with synthetic data. The key, as again I sort of mentioned briefly last year, is you've got about 15 seconds to keep people's interest in calculators. You want to ask the minimum number of questions possible to get the most valid and accurate results. So the only things that we mandate are the integrated report, all of it, and also a blast percentage that has been correlated over the different modalities. As I'm sure you're aware, that can vary. So what I have here is a synthetic patient. So essentially, we've kind of mocked up a case of an acute myeloid leukemia. So it's completely in its kind of native form, which basically means it's just kind of essentially could be copy and pasted from any of the reports from any of the HMDSs all over the country. Just to go back to the demonstration, so we pop in an agreed blast percentage of 35%. And then the next step is to upload the report and simply open. And we're going to say, in this case, just for the sake of argument, that yes, there is a germline predisposition, and we'll just stick in DDX 41, just to make things nice and confusing. And this is the case of T53 as well, just to kind of show you it's a complicated example. After you've done that, that's all the information you need, and you click on Validate Report. So this zips through very quickly, but this is the kind of the nub of and the important part of and why we think the Hemio is actually quite good and different, because it really validates to make sure that you've got the exact accurate information withdrawn using the large language model, and confirms not only that you've extracted the data correctly, but also that the sample that you've put in is valid. So you all know the phrase kind of rubbish in, rubbish out. If you put a rubbish report in of all insufficient samples, you're not going to get something good out. So it's really important that we can kind of highlight that and flag that. Obviously, the T53 in ICC and WHO varies quite significantly. So we do have this kind of human-in-the-loop thing. And again, we think this is quite important, could potentially be simplified. But basically what we're doing here is just checking with the user, is the data that we've extracted with regards to your T53 mutation accurate as far as you're aware? So you can kind of tick through that, and then you can confirm and proceed. The next step is really about the data validation. So is this data good enough for you to make an integrated report from it? And again, just to say here, it's really kind of open and it's really transparent. And I think maybe one of the nice things that we can demonstrate to you here is that this is what data has been extracted from your report. So you can see the morphological differentiation, you can see the flow section, and you can see the diagnostic integration. Crucially, at this stage, we also make sure that, you know, for the sake of argument, if you put a case of myeloma through or a case of MPAL or ALL, this section will flag to you and say, look, hold on a minute, this doesn't look like AML. Are you sure you want to proceed? So again, you can inspect if things have gone wrong or you think things have gone wrong, you can have a look and exactly see where, why and where. So again, proceed with the classification. So this is the sort of the main kind of landing page after you've put the data in. Again, just by way of transparency and inspecting the data, if you say, hold on a minute, this has got T53 in it, but I didn't write T53 in the report, you kind of tap on the T53 button and it takes you to where in your report the T53 has been mentioned. And you can do this again for all of the mutations and it will pick them out for you. So again, it's that kind of inspection component, no kind of black box here. It will give you the ICC and the WHO, and again, probably importantly, it gives you the clinical reasoning. So if you're quibbling as to, is this the right diagnosis, is this not the right diagnosis, and perhaps if you were taking it to an MDT and you want to know exactly why you reached that conclusion, this will give you the answer for it. And a pretty neat thing we can actually demonstrate is this thing called an execution tree. So basically, this just kind of is small, but the long and the short of it is that it shows you the algorithm that we use to derive at the decision that we have made for the individual in question. So you can just follow them along on the red line, and you can work out exactly why your patient has got that diagnosis. Moving on, we have given a risk stratification. Here, again, we demonstrate sort of very clearly exactly why we got to that classification, and we offer some advice regarding MRD monitoring. One part of the platform that we're kind of trying to develop and probably isn't quite yet at an advanced stage is the clinical trial matching. So basically what we can do from NIHR, Cancer Research UK websites is to kind of gather the trials that are available for for patients. And we do initially a kind of a rough screen or matching for the patient on the first screen. And then if you think the patient potentially is eligible for it, you can click on each individual link. And quite a neat feature, so obviously for some of the kind of earlier phase clinical trials, they're perhaps just in London or Glasgow or Manchester. If you put the patient's postcode in, it will also kind of rank them in terms of how close the patient is to the particular trial, because doing some of our kind of patient involvement in this, when we've done the surveys, treatment closer to home is something that's really, really important to patients, and they're also really keen to be aware of clinical trials as well. So that's something that we're kind of actively working on, and we will continue to test. So that's the sort of the core module. We've got kind of other modules as well. Perhaps I'll just kind of demonstrate one to you, which is the treatment recommendations. So we've been working alongside our colleague Tom Coates from the Southwest. And some of you may know that he's done a Delphi poll of AML treatment recently. So for UK consensus guidelines for about 30 or 40 different types of patient with a kind of different combinations of mutations, what treatment would we recommend? So again, sort of very straightforward process. You pick your patient, you upload the information, give the age, so say this is a 55-year-old human, you click the button, and again, the data is extracted in exactly the same way, and you get the original report. You can inspect it as per before, and then you can go on to the treatment recommendations for the patient, giving you, are they allo mandated, are there any options that are non-HS funded, and what the recommendations are from the Delphi poll. So this is probably more of an educational module and probably something that's slightly different to the diagnostics, perhaps less interested for the group in front of us, but it's very much a flexible system, and I think the beauty is that once you've extracted the data, you can then do quite a lot of stuff with it. So it's very possible to do kind of follow-up longitudinal. You could, for example, put a patient MDT report in, and it can show you the follow-up. Has their MRD reached the certain thresholds? So that's something we're going to kind of expand on and progress. So yeah, so that's pretty much the demonstration. Oh, yeah, sorry, yes, crucial. So we're here to talk about MDTs and making things useful for people, and I forgot one of the most important parts. So once you have got your patient and you've got your classification, then the next question is, how can we make this useful for MDTs and for kind of communicating information? So again, pretty straightforward. So you put a patient's name in, so I'll just use my initials, definitely not my date of birth, but I will put one in. And create and generate a PDF. And then basically you get this. So it's a kind of we did some user feedback, and basically people wanted quite a kind of a clean, simplistic report. So we've hopefully produced one here. So it gives you your basics of your classification, your risk. And again, so if you're going to an MDT and perhaps you're a district general consultant and you might be questioned by someone who's an expert, why did you get to this diagnosis? Well, it's explained to you here underneath. So hopefully that's useful for people too. It's got the risk classification and it's got advice with regards to MRT monitoring. So we hope that would potentially be useful for MDTs. So that's basically the demonstration done. I've got kind of 5 or so minutes for questions. So John, very welcome to come back up. You're good at answering questions.
I'm just going to say well done.
Supposed to be doing a live demo.
Scary, a bit cool, so exciting stuff. So questions, please, from the audience or online, if we can detect them.
Thank you for that, Luke and John. That was really insightful in terms of the AI. I've just got a question about the AI. So the MLL lab do use AI for clinical reporting and things like that. And I was at a meeting the other day where Torsten discussed this. And he was saying on average that he receives 2.5 results for actually being able to generate a clinical report, a diagnostic report. I'm just wondering if there is a minimum requirement for your actual report generation.
No, so the long and the short of it, it is no. So when you get to the validation kind of stage, what it will do is it will highlight that, okay, so you haven't given us a Trefine here, or the cytogenetics aren't available for this patient. So you can opt to continue at that stage, but it's kind of caveated by saying that the information isn't complete. So we don't say a minimum, but what we do is say that the results would not necessarily be valid if there's a lack of information.
I mean, for example, in TP53, if you can choose to select complex cytogenetics as a surrogate for a TP53 mutation that's allowed by ICC, but you are told it's better to actually use a formal technique to confirm as opposed to doing that. But it's then the diagnosticians or clinicians' choice to take or perform the additional test.
Okay. Oh, is it me? Thank you, that was great. Did you have to put the morphology and flow and genetics and everything else in a particular order, or you just copy-paste straight from the report?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's completely agnostic to how the data is provided. We simply extract the results that are required for the algorithm. I have to put my hand up and say I've not yet made the flow into an algorithm. It's on my to-do list. At the moment, it's a pure AI interpretation, but we felt that's okay because it's only an initial validation check. It can be overruled by the clinician if they disagree.
And also, just to add to that, it's actually language agnostic as well. So I've been doing some work in Cambodia, and we've been using a sort of a slightly different format of this with them, and they report both in, so they speak in Khmer, they write in French, and they do their MDTs in English. So we can't do Khmer, but French is a possibility. So, yeah.
Wonderful, merci.
Thanks, that's really beautiful. I just had a question about the clinical trials aspect of it and how implementable you think that really is. Because I'm always mindful with trials going anywhere on a report that, first of all, we have to assume the patient may see that report. And also, at least in my area of clinical practice, whether or not you're eligible for a trial is not just about your genomics, it's about a whole lot of other things, particularly what therapies you've had, whether you've responded, all of those things. And I wonder, I don't think it is actually on this final report, but do you think that's really something that we should be aiming to do in the future?
Interesting. We've been doing patient talks. That's not their priority. Their priority really is information, not which trial can I go on. But there are people who want to. We have switch on and switch off for our final report. You don't have to share anything. But yes, the clinical trials module is mainly aimed as a kind of data scrubber, data identification to guide an MDT. And hopefully at the MDT, the decisions you talk about are in there. And equally, everything we're doing is the moment is in flux, but an MDT opinion is a perfectly reasonable thing to have as part of that. So, if someone is, yes, this patient is immensely frail and has had 5 course of treatment for their melanoma, then that can be recorded. Yeah.
And I just say, so I didn't show you So when you, if you were to select a clinical trial, so basically if you want to view more trials, it then asks you for sort of more information about the patient. So it will ask you for ECOG performance status, it will ask you for prior lines of treatment, it will ask you for their postcode. So hopefully that goes some way to kind of filtering out some of the trials that they might not be suitable for, but understand it's not perfect.
Question about there.
Really quick question, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
When, cheeky question, when might it be available for us to use locally?
Regulators have a huge impact. We still don't even know whether this is class 1, class 2, class 2A, class 2B. We think it's not class 3. It could go out now as an educational tool in which you're not allowed to use any of its conclusions to guide your treatment. However, we do have a roadmap to regulation, and as soon as we've got that, we'll go out more formally.
Just a question for this. What do you want this audience to do to help you?
Okay, wow. We'd love some letters of approval and support. We might ignore it if you say don't use it, I'm sorry. But if anyone is a true believer, we'd love that. If someone would like to have a play with synthetic cases, I don't want real people going in there, a play with synthetic cases to see how it works, identify problems, identify missing elements and tell us, that would also be fantastic from a developmental point of view. And we'd like people not to be frightened. If you have concerns about what's going on, I've always sort of felt this is kind of like the future. If we don't do it, someone else will. But I do appreciate the sensitivities, and I do appreciate that valuing the things we do is really important, and therefore those concerns I think we should address right up front so everyone's comfortable with what we're doing. So if people want to email myself or ideally Luke, who reads his emails more effectively, we would be very grateful to have your help in developing all this. Other things, maybe if anyone really wants it, we could do for a workshop at some point, but you know, let us know.
Thanks, guys. Some AML is not too difficult. Like if it's an NPM1, then that's what it is. But I mean, the example you presented there is a bit more challenging. Do you have a feeling, or do you have any data to say that the AI model is either better or quicker than humans at getting it right?
Yeah, so quicker, most definitely. So sort of as a rough and ready sometimes. I think actually a case very similar to this, myself and John spent about 15 minutes arguing over it, and then we had made a synthetic patient kind of roughly similar, and it came up with the correct answer in about 30 seconds. One of the rate-limiting steps here is accessing to kind of real patient data. Understandably, there's lots of kind of ethical approval. We have ethics now in place to do it with patients in our trust. So I think we're going to kind of formalize it, hopefully kind of do peer-reviewed papers just for kind of openness and transparency from that point of view. But I think kind of anecdotally, we've got a very good, sometimes scarily better than us results, and certainly a lot quicker. But part of so it's not only putting the patients through, that's the bit that we want to know, you know, how many patients have you put this through, how many are right. There's also other parts to it that we're putting the report, the same patient through 10,000 times to making sure it gives us the same result. That's something called eval, and that's something that the tech guys really need. And then there's this mathematical calculation that basically proves that it can't be wrong, which is something, again, that the tech people want, that I'm learning to understand. So the patient aspect of it, to us, in my head, it's the most important, but my understanding from the technological side of it, the other two are as, if not more important.
1 minute left, so ask in the break if you would take
Hi, that was really lovely. I just wanted to check, how do you keep it up to date, like with updates in classification and in prognostic scores, and then also clinical trials? We have found it's incredibly difficult to keep that information up to date with clinical trials opening and closing, commercial trials opening that in one site and that you don't know about. Like, I think that's quite a difficult thing to keep up to date.
Yeah.
It's a process called web scrubbing. Scrubbing, both. Hey. There's a process, it's called web scraping. If you're on Teams, please delete. The web scraping basically means you point it at the websites, it compares the information it has with the up-to-date information. It is then sent to us for curation. So we will have to approve sort of new trials being adopted, but thereafter, It will scrape the sites that are important, update the system, and it's done by an algorithm and a web bot, not by us.
Great. Thank you, everybody. If you take a seat, we're going to crack on.
Okay. Firstly, I'd like to thank Tom for, and everyone that's organised this for inviting me here to speak today. I think John and Luke have both set the scene for what I'm about to talk about. So just for those that may not know, last year I issued an email for individuals to send me copies of, anonymised copies of their integrated reports. And ideally, I wanted an ALL and an AML just to be able to compare reporting practices and structures and similarities and differences. And this is the output from that. So I'm not here to give my opinions on what is right and what is wrong. I'm here to facilitate and feedback our findings so that the wider network can discuss potential areas for improvement or harmonisation. So, like John said earlier, when he was talking about the NG47 guidance, when you talk about integrated reporting and you look to the NG47 guidance, it only has 3 things in there. And in line with Quality Standard 150 as part of NG47, there is a need to produce an integrated report that includes all the pertinent information for a multidisciplinary team to be able to make a diagnosis, and it should include all necessary disease management. It also says that report diagnoses should be subtyped according to the WHO, and I just want to note that given this was published in 2016, this was prior to the emergence of parallel WHO and ICC guidance. And it also states that IT systems should allow for integrated reporting. So today I'm more going to focus on the first 2 aspects of the NG47 guidance, and then I'm going to provide an update in relation to changes that we're making within our programs. And as I previously said, while NG47 almost mandates integrated reports, it doesn't actually provide any feedback on the information that's required, the actual structure or the formats that need to be for an integrated report to be assessed. So initially, we're going to look at actual structure and content. So as I've said at the beginning of my introduction, I asked for copies of anonymised reports, and of the 25 centres, we received example reports from 12 centres, so I'd just like to thank those centres first and foremost, and just like to point out that all of those centres were from England, so what I'm about to discuss may be different from some of the devolved nations. And as reflected through the lack of guidance in NG47, it probably comes as no surprise that there were several different styles for integrated reporting, and I think it comes back to John's presentation as well, where it's also down to sort of like local structures that are in place in terms of potential limb systems and how they operate. And I think while they vary by style and structure, I think we can broadly categorise these into 4 main approaches. Now, this is 4 main approaches from the actual reports I've reviewed. This doesn't necessarily mean that there are only 4 approaches. There may well be more from within centres. So the first approach is what I've sort of titled the conclusion first approach. And I think I describe it later as the what it is, sort of like headline results straight in your face. And this was utilised by half of centres, sort of like returning their results. And like I said, the final integrated conclusion is reported sort of like headline after all patient details. And then detailed individual reports from each pathology discipline are then reported after in detail. Some of them are more extensive than others. Some of them sort of go into manufacturers that are utilising the fish probes that these are utilised. Some of them are providing all information relating to all antibody, the panels that they've utilised for immunophenotyping. But essentially they are in detail. The next approach that was utilised by 4 centres is the executive summary approach. So there's a summary of all pathology results at the front of the report. The final integrated conclusion then follows, and then the detailed individual reports from each pathology modality are then included. And I'm sure some of you may well recognise some of your approaches as we go through this discussion. The next 2, they were only reported by 1 individual centre for both of the next 2, but I thought it worth including just to give a summary of everyone's kind of approach. So a detailed report is, the detailed results are sort of described first, and I relate to this later as to the how we got there approach, and then the overall integrated diagnostic conclusion is provided after. And then there's the synoptic summary approach. So this was perhaps maybe the shortest approach, again used by 1 centre, and just a generalised summary of each result from each pathology discipline was provided, and then a final integrated diagnostic conclusion documented in accordance with WHO-Hem4, WHO-Hem5 and ICC. So just to put that on one slide, we've got the conclusion first, what it is approach, where there's patient sample information, and then a final integrated conclusion with detailed individual reports following. We've got an executive summary report which gives sort of like the big picture. It provides a summary of the key findings initially. It then provides the diagnostic conclusions, and then it provides more detailed information after everything else. We've got the sequential approach where you identify exactly how you got there, so you give information in detail at the front end of the report and slowly work through to then give a final integrated diagnostic conclusion. And then we've got, as I've mentioned, the synoptic summary, which is just a summary of all the key findings, followed by the integrated conclusion. And this one is literally, what are the key things that we need to make this diagnosis? And just to go back to my first slide, where NG47 outlined that integrated reports should include all the information needed for disease management, and they should be shared with the relevant multidisciplinary teams. Review of all these, in my opinion, all of these structures meet that requirement. So going forward, I'm talking about report content now, and specifically how people are producing and providing those conclusions in accordance with WHO or ICC. So there was variation observed in how centres report the diagnostic conclusions, and also how they reference the actual WHO and ICC classification guidelines. So I'm going to talk about 3 main approaches here. Approach 1, so this was a diagnostic conclusion-based approach reported by 6 centres. So within the actual report, the report heading either stated diagnostic conclusion, diagnostic summary, or final diagnosis. And when people were actually making those conclusions, 4 centres actually made those conclusions without any specific reference to WHO or ICC classifications. And in other instances, those conclusions were actually referenced within that final conclusion, with participants and individuals either reporting WHO, ICC, or both. So the second approach was the WHO diagnosis or ICDO classification reporting, and the report headlines for this approach was either WHO diagnosis, ICDO description, or ICDO code. And the final diagnostic conclusion was outlined, but the specificity of a reference to WHO was not made and not explicitly stated. In some instances, you could determine whether it was WHO 4 or WHO 5, but it wasn't explicit. And probably unsurprisingly, given the individuals actually report under the heading ICDO description, 4 out of 5 of these centres actually also included the ICDO code in their diagnostic conclusions. So approach 3 was very specific, so it was a framework-specific reporting approach. This centre actually had specific report headings for WHO 4, WHO 5, and ICC. So it was, you could tell exactly what conclusion related to what classification system. And like I said, there's separate diagnostic conclusions in each heading box. That was, yeah, like I said, that was utilised by one centre. So I did review all the diagnostic conclusions that were provided, and they did all align with WHO or ICC classifications. But the structure and referencing and the explicitness of the guidelines and recommendations utilised varied significantly. And I'd just like to point out at this moment in time, sort of like the BSH stance on the actual reporting. They released this guidance last year, so the BSH Laboratory Specialist Interpretation Group, Specialist Interest Group even, and the British Lymphoma Group proposed that WHO 5 classifications and ICC should be provided if these two conclusions differ. It also stated that some centres may wish to report both, even if the actual classifications and conclusions are the same. And they did also state that it is up to local individual centres to also decide whether it's relevant and informative to local clinicians to also include the HEME 4th edition revised diagnostic classification as well. So just going on to giving a breakdown of ICDO report coding within the integrated reports. So again, practices varied, but there were 7 centres that didn't report this information within their clinical report, but there were also 5 that did. So just before I move on to actually discuss our changes within EQA that may be relevant for the audience today, I just thought I'd give a summary on the structure and content of the clinical reports. And as I've already said, I just want to keep reiterating and going back to this, NG 47 says and states that we should be issuing integrated reports, but it gives absolutely no guidance on how we should be doing the report structures, the contents, etc., other than the fact that we should be providing a subtyped diagnostic classification based on WHO and now ICC. I believe that maybe there is perhaps an opportunity to standardise different reporting classifications. Again, I'm in no means mandating from our perspective that everyone should do something this way or that way and this works best. I'm purely a facilitator here today, and I think it's the decision of the group to actually determine whether this is necessary. Obviously, the actual resources needed and the IT systems that may need changing, there are obviously restrictions there. And like I said, I think there is an opportunity, and where there is an opportunity is in relation to how we feed back that information about the WHO classifications that we are reporting on and the ICC, and whether there is the inclusion of the ICDO coding within a report and how we actually manage that, because I think one of the problems that I was discussing with John when we had a brief meeting yesterday, was actually you don't want double reporting of the ICDO code that then biases clinical cancer repositories. So you get an initial diagnostic presentation from an individual, and then you get a follow-up, and the ICDO code then feeds into the actual cancer repositories again. And just to conclude with the integrated report aspect, I do believe that everything and all the different structures actually provided all the relevant information for diagnostic and disease management of a patient. And just to reiterate, there was some disparity. And as I've previously said, I believe that is for the HMDS network to actually discuss. But I also believe that UK NECRAS can continue to act as a facilitator. We remain neutral in terms of what we believe is good or bad or indifferent. We're not here to judge that, but we can act as a neutral entity if there are further needs for review of report structures or questionnaires that people wish to focus on. And I believe that this forum is the place where we could actually feed that back when there are lots of individuals here and present. So looking forward, and this specifically relates to UK NECRAS LI and our changes that we are implementing within and in relation to two specific programs. So the leukemia immunophenotyping and the leukemia diagnostic interpretation programs. So my colleague Stu Scott is the director for UK NECRAS, and Sam, he's also in the audience as well. They are here so that if there are any questions after this presentation or at lunch, you can approach us with these questions. Probably, maybe throwing Sam under the bus here, but he is the actual scientific lead. So if all questions can be addressed towards him, that would be much appreciated. Sorry, Sam. Just to give everyone an overview of the actual programs, at this moment in time, the way that these are designed means that they are actually linked. So for the leukemia immunophenotyping, or I'm just going to say and refer to it as the LI program from now on, because it's a bit of a mouthful. So a leukemia sample is issued, so we fix an actual leukemia sample and then issue it to participants for them to be able to actually test the samples with the appropriate antigens and panels as they would a routine diagnostic sample. And this is based on the clinical details and the clinical information that we provide, the full blood count and some digital images that we also provide as well. And results are submitted via our participant hub and our portal. And we want participants to return the actual antigens that they use and also whether these were positive or negative in relation to the malignant population that they've identified. And when we feed back and we've analysed these reports, our report contains 20 of the top antigens that have been tested and also a consensus result as to whether these are positive or negative. And participant performance monitoring is based on the panel design. So the number of consensus top 10 antigens that an actual laboratory test for, and also the number of antigens from the actual consensus that are in and out of consensus in terms of negativity or positivity. So for LDI, again, this is a mouthful, so I'm just going to shorten it to LDI. This is actually a fully electronic trial. And this program assesses a lab's ability to actually diagnose leukemia based on multiple results from multiple different disciplines. And each trial tends to consist of either all of this information or a subset of this information. So it will routinely contain a clinical history for all actual cases that we issue. And then digital blood film, cytogenetics, molecular genetics, histopathology, if we do have any information. And the immunophenotype is not a patient-derived immunophenotype. It's actually the immunophenotype that is linked to the LI program. So the actual top 20 consensus antigens that have been tested and the actual results from that as well. And performance monitoring is based on one of two processes. So it's either the actual correct diagnosis, and that is determined by our steering committee, and or an actual differential diagnosis where the actual results are maybe lacking, or the clinical history is lacking some detail, or testing is not available. So the idea going forward is to actually separate these two programs. So we don't have them interlinked anymore. We're not using a consensus phenotype from LI to actually utilising the LDI. And this will happen from April 2026. So this is our next trial year. So we run from April to April. So this will be the next annual trial schedule. And we believe that this enables an actual broader variety of cases for HMDS networks to actually be assessing. A lot of the time, we rely on samples that are donated, and we'll need a large volume of samples for these samples and for these trials. So uncoupling this means that we don't need that for the LDI, which means we can issue more interesting cases, and we can issue a broader range of cases that maybe are more reflective of what is going on in a HMDS network, as opposed to potentially, for example, us issuing CLLs for review, something that's really going to actually require discussions within your MDTs or your sign-out meetings, whatever you may do to actually report the final integrated report, or John, I know he said that there are interim reports as well. And I've just put this rider in because I think we've issued this information to our participants that in some instances, selected cases may still be shared between LI and LDI, but the plan is to try and keep them separate. And with this, and sort of like separating the actual programs, there comes a challenge of being able to build this electronic case library, so to speak. And We currently utilise a lot of samples which are derived from our steering committees or our specialist advisory group or our local clinicians. And the problem is, if we have a broader range of actual cases which are maybe more complex than normal, what we run the risk of is not testing participants or the participants where we're receiving these cases from, not testing their ability to accurately diagnose, but more accurately recall, this case sounds familiar, can anyone remember it? Oh, it was this case, this is the answer. And you're not testing an actual lab's ability to derive a conclusion, you're testing their recall capability. And I think this is probably partly a plea from this network. Essentially, the more cases that we have from different HMDS centres, the less chance and the less likely that we are testing recall and we are actually testing quality assessment and actual diagnostics. And as I've said, we would potentially need the HMDS network support for this. So not only does it allow deeper and more challenging cases for LDI, but in terms of the LI programme, we will require new responses, different responses. So it's an approximate diagnosis based on the immunophenotyping results. So it's not deep-rooted. It may be a general disease entity classification. So this is a chronic disease, it's an acute disease. This is a myeloid malignancy, this is a lymphoid malignancy. And we are also asking that participants feedback information about further testing recommendations based on the immunophenotyping results. And it provides better feedback for participants and allows them to actually compare their performance within the actual community. And just to comment, we're aware of increasing use of spectral flow cytometry. I'm sure this is something that maybe Tim and Ruth will discuss after me, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but we do want to try and remain platform agnostic. Essentially, this is just to conclude and summarise that we do need your help in facilitating these changes and building this case library. And just finally, I know I've got probably less than a minute left now. This is just a call for samples. So in order that our LI programme also works, we do rely on actual patient material and samples that are donated. So if anyone is interested in understanding more specifics of the requirements for samples that we need, then please reach out to us. And we have some information packs and some consent packs that people can take away with them today if they so need to. Thank you.
So we've got maybe 1 minute or so for any burning questions, but if you've got any sort of detailed questions at lunchtime, so one question in the back there.
Thank you. That was really interesting. The changes to the LDI Part 2 bit of the process sound really positive and like there'll be a much better assessment of whether an HMDS is working properly. Are you going to change the name? Because LDI doesn't really describe what you're going to be testing.
I think we can take that feedback on board. Yeah, I think it's something that we locally will have to discuss, but yeah, thank you for that feedback and we'll be sure to take that on board and discuss. I don't want to commit to say yes or no. That's not my decision. So we will take that into account though, so thank you.
Very quick question. Are you going to change the frequency? Or is it still going to say?
I don't believe so, no. Not at this moment in time. No, not at this moment in time.
Great, thank you. So change the name to Integrated Reporting EQA, and I've already asked Ash and John and Luke to work together on kind of, because they've approached the same question in two different ways, I think. So thank you, Ash, and thank you, NEQAS. Right, so moving on to another part of NEQAS, so we're going to have Ruth and Tim talk about the flow cytometry network.
making sure we've got enough time for lunch. So, sticking on with the theme of going with the flow, can you all hear me okay? Fantastic. So, we posed the idea at the last meeting about trying to create some sort of network for flow cytometrists. And we sort of put a reach and a plea out, and they're seeing that the room has grown in size, so has the number of flow cytometrists in the room. So I think we're already starting to work our way to the goal of what we want. So to start off, how to address what does a flow cytometry network look like, we issued a baseline survey. And the baseline survey was in some ways restricted in that it went to members of or known facilities within the HMDS network. So we had quite a good response across the whole of the UK, including the devolved nations. We had 18 responses. Very good that we're all accredited to UCAS, as we so should be, so we know that quality is at the heart of everything we do as flow cytometrists. And in terms of where the interest was coming from, it was coming across from the whole of the UK, including Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. In terms of what we're representative, what we're doing, obviously majority are reporting Haemonc diagnostics, PNH and MRD, focusing very highly at what we do. So they're the most common themes. But we also have quite a few centres still doing paediatrics, CD34 enumeration, transplant immune monitoring, PID and HLA-B27. We didn't ask about CAR-T, but that is something obviously that we're very interested in, and as a network, as we grow, hopefully we can get more involvement in terms of sort of novel therapies. So something this survey actually asked is, we wanted to actually survey the landscape. What are we doing? What is the population? And the median population is about 2.5 million covered, but that ranges from sort of 1 to 3 million from the services that we had. So up to 8.5 million was the range. So even though it looks, 2.5, is it big, is it not? The rate, we mustn't lose the fact that the range does go up to 8 million. In terms of annual tests, this is quite an interesting figure. 5,600 is the median, with a range of up to from about 4,000 to 11,000 tests per year. And interestingly, 30% of the respondents reported even greater than 10,000 tests per year. The growth rate is about 10% per annum, and that is sustainable, that is increasing. So what we're doing doesn't drop off. We know that flow cytometry services are valued and that we're seeing contained growth rate. And because we're seeing this contained growth rate, and because we're seeing this is large volume of tests, there is no one-size-fits-all approach, because there are some services that are doing more than others. So we have to make sure that the workload and the case mix that we're all doing, the network can support all services. So network outputs need to be really tiered. So if we're looking at standards, we need minimal standards that will apply to everyone. We have to use benchmarking very carefully, and when we conduct surveys, we have to be very, very meaningful about who we're reaching out to. But like I said, the growth is real, and the growth is sustained across the network. So one of the questions we want to know is how do services run? What are people doing in terms of hours? What are their turnaround times? And the majority of services are doing 5-day weeks. A few people will do sort of extended hours, long days, particularly at weekends and bank holidays. A few centres doing very ad hoc on-call out of hours, where it'd be called in. And some services, very few centres doing 6 days a week. So in terms of operational efficiency, there's quite a wide range of what's going on. In terms of monitoring turnaround times, again, the question is, do we use calendar days? Do we use working days? Most centres were using 72 hours as their cut-off for routine diagnostics. Urgents, as we expect, within the same day, with a range of 4 to 48 hours. MRD, 72 hours. And then, obviously, very urgent work for stem cell enumeration, getting results within 2 hours. The next thing we want to know is, so we know about what people are doing in terms of numbers. We know, their turnaround times. The next question is, what actually slows that turnaround time? What are the bottlenecks that you feel within your services? And workforce and sample transport were the overriding features, with some reporting as well. And we'll come on to talk about workforce a little bit later. But in terms of skill mix, that was certainly a concern within the network. Sample transport, again, network, as a network, can we address how we receive our samples in an adequate time so we aren't seeing cellular loss and degradation? But also reporting, interim reporting versus final reporting. How many people still issue interim reports? Should we just be looking at trying to reduce the turnaround time, support ourselves as a network to have just a final report going out? So workforce, transport, reporting, and also LIMS and IT. There are some very big LIMS and IT providers, but in terms of how much support we get with what we want as flow cytometrists for LIMS and IT isn't always there. So in terms of workforce baseline, where does the capacity sit? And we know that the majority of people working in the laboratories are biomedical scientists. So we've got a median whole-time equivalent of 4 biomedical scientists within a laboratory, a scattering of clinical scientists, a few medics reporting, and then we've got some MLA and MTOs reporting. So of course, as we expect, biomedical scientists are at the forefront of what we do with a few scattered clinical scientists. In terms of if we want to standardize data, we need to look at how do we plumb this data to produce a right-sized department. And that's not just saying, well, we deal with 20 million cases a year, we need this number of people. It's what are you actually doing within that service? Are you doing a lot of MRD work? Are you doing more sort of niche work? Are you doing a lot more 4 and 8 work, etc.? So I think when we're looking at data, we need to be very careful that when we're talking about right-sizing a department, that department, the right size, fits for what their purpose is. So we know about the number of people in the labs. We know how many labs are actually, what people are doing. In terms of trying to get more people into your labs, what is the hardest thing for recruitment? What drives people away? And what's the most difficult things? And it's finding people with the right skill mix. We are looking, I look at the people in the room, and a lot of the flow cytometrists are younger than me, which is a good thing, but we know that there are younger flow cytometrists coming through, people interested in flow cytometry. We need to sort of nourish that and nurture these people to develop the skill mix who are going to take over from old fogies like me. People are also concerned about the training pipeline. There was, the IBMS did a fantastic portfolio in flow cytometry. That no longer exists. The IBMS have said, we're not going to do it anymore. That was a fantastic training resource for developing specifically flow cytometrists for clinical diagnostic labs. So is this something that maybe a network and us as flow cytometrists could adopt, maybe with the support of the BSH, with the Royal College, to maybe take that and develop our own portfolio for training, how we want these people trained. And then obviously things like banding, location is always going to be a contentious subject for actually getting people into the door. But what you've got them in, what pushes people away? What drives the risk of people going? And again, career progression, what do we want our flow cytometrists to be? What do they want out of it? These are sort of two-way discussions we have to have. We have to have a very clear career progression path for these flow cytometrists. And if we're talking about training, we don't have a formal route of training of flow cytometrists. But that doesn't just have to be flow cytometry. We could develop a portfolio for integrated reporting, have that in there, have a little bit of genetics in there. Develop our scientific workforce to actually not work in silos, but actually work together. And I know that I've had discussions with a number of people in the room about how we may take that forward. And I think that's something as a network of both the clinicians in the room and the scientists in the room working together, we could actually produce a very cohesive training pathway for scientists and the scientists of the future. So very simply, we ask, what are people testing? Of course, everyone's testing a variety of tissues, blood, bone marrow, CSF, pleural, pericardial acidic. So long as it's in the liquid, we'll stick it through a flow cytometer. Most people are doing, the core sort of bench work of the core sort of tissues that we'd expect. A few people doing lymph node FNAs. Of course, we're expecting that to grow. We know that Bill Saul published the Purple Book in the WHO. We're expecting FNA work to increase over time. If we talk about how we want to standardize FNA reporting by flow, again, this is something that we've not really discussed, and it's something that a network we could probably do. Core biopsies, trophine biopsies, a few centers doing those. But centers might be interested in saying, I'd like to develop Trefine, flow cytometry? Who would I approach to that? As a network, what about instrumentation, standardization of instrumentation? Well, we know it's mixed. The survey showed that we've got a mixture of, obviously the two bigger companies within the UK. I should say that BD now no longer exists. BD is now Waters. So as of 2-3 weeks ago, they're now the Waters Corporation, very big in mass spec, but the BD Life Sciences sort of pulled out and are now under Waters. BD sort of medical tech is still there, so they'll still do infusion pumps and vacuotainers. But so Waters/BD, Fax Lyrics, Fax Cantos, still a few of them around. People using the Duet, Coulter with the DX Flex, the Navios, Celmec. And there are a lot of centres who reported that they are currently transitioning between the two. Some going from Coulter to BD or Waters, some going from Waters to Coulter. And in terms of acquisition, a lot of people using different platforms, even though they're using the same flow cytometers, whether it be Fax Suite, Diva, Kaluza, Infinisight, other AI programs are available. There is a big mixture of what we're doing. But if you've got an issue with those, who do you approach? How do you get standardization across what is changing so rapidly? And anything that we decide as a network really does have to be vendor agnostic. I mean, that's a key point. In terms of panels, how we actually selecting what panels we do? So we asked people, what are they doing first? 6 centres said, well, we look at the morphology first. Some people say we've got AI now, but morphology is a dying art. God, that would put a stake through my heart. Morphology, I still love looking down the microscope. Clinical details and history, if you're lucky, if your referrers are actually going to provide that information in the first place. But we have to drive that forward. We want morphology, history, a mixed approach is probably best. In terms of how are people building their panels, so majority of centres in the UK are developing lab-developed tests. Obviously with IVDR, that's a whole other discussion for another day, which will probably take a week to discuss, but IVDR is something we have to be concerned about. Some people using a mixture of CIVD locked, maybe some lyophilized tubes, pre-configured kits, a few centres doing that. In terms of the number of fluorochromes that we're using per panel, so a lot of these flow cytometers, and I'm not going to talk about spectral, sorry for people who wanted me to, we're sort of focusing just on what we're currently using at the moment. Majority of centres are still using 8 colour, but the flow cytometers, even the most modern ones now, are doing 13, 14 colours. So are we utilising them to the best we can? As flow cytometrists, we do have a very strong base that we can work on. We asked about competency assessment and how people are doing in terms of EQA engagement. And a lot of people said they've got sort of the competency is reassessed sort of frequency-wise every 2 years. But how do we assess that competency? There's no written documentation to say, obviously there's the BCSH guidelines that say you should do so many cases per year, but what do we actually mean in terms of doing those cases? Does it include technical, analytical, or interpretive comments? Should it include them all? What was very exciting is that everyone is still very much engaged in widespread EQA with UK NEQAS, so that long may that continue. Control and standardization across machines. People are doing, as we expect, daily instrument, sort of EQA, quality control, bead-based control, some cross-site comparisons. Now, because we have a very strong base to build on, it's not just the opportunity of what we're doing, it's how can we share what we're doing across the network. So we want to, everyone's doing their own competency frameworks, but can we come up with a single approach that may be the best way to reduce the training burden across our services? Will it involve sort of sharing scientists between centres? Would people like to go and learn from another centre? And a network is the only way that's going to help developing the scientists of the future. Talking about rolling competency cycles, is 2 years enough? Do we need to look more about case-based discussions? Do we need to look at more RC path-styled questions? People's faces scare there. But do we do like mini FRC path sort of questionnaires within competency assessments? And can we link that competency to the career progression, going back to what scientists want? They want to see a clear progression within what they're doing. So we asked people, what are your main goals? What would you like for the network? And obviously, as we'd expect, standardization and best practice. How you define those is obviously can be different between different people. But that is the goal of what people wanted from the network. Everyone wanted some type of standardization and best practice across all the laboratories. But also collaboration and peer support featured very highly, and there's going to be a slide a bit later on which Ruth will talk about, which is how valued we're feeling as a network of flow cytometrists, and the responses were quite scary. Education and training again featured very highly up the agenda. We asked people, would you be willing to engage within the network, and would you be happy to, if we came up with some solutions or some ideas for sort of trying to develop some solutions to problems, would you be interested? Everyone was pretty much happy to contribute, certainly attend and share knowledge across the network, and we had a good response for those that wanted to lead a work stream. So we have people who are eager to engage, and I think that sums us up as flow cytometrists. We can work together and work with work streams. So what the baseline is telling us is that the demand is very clear. We need standardization and best practice, and we want collaboration and education across the network. The community is really ready and willing to engage and willing to develop work streams. In terms of operation, we've got most people doing 5-day services. There are some that do out of hours, and there is a willingness, we know, there's a requirement to do extended practice, and that also feeds into the NG47 guidance. LIMS and IT, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but we are dealing with big data. The big data needs support from LIMS and IT. In our trust, we do have a pathology IT team who are ex-scientists who are very engaged with what we do. I think we do need support within LIMS and IT for what we do as flow cytometrists generating big data. We have technical diversity, so what we do as a network, as we said, has to be vendor agnostic, it has to be tiered, and it has to be applicable to all. But one thing we can say is that the culture quality is very strong amongst us. We're all involved in UCAS, EQA, competency frameworks. So really as a network, we want to share the best practices and our experiences to reduce duplicated effort across the network when we're trying to solve our problems. So that's really what the baseline survey was showing us. And then we had a webinar, which I'm going to hand over to Ruth for. And that webinar has generated a lot of discussion points. We had some polls in there, and we're going to show you that data now. And the plan will be to write this up and feed back to the network as a whole. But we really want buy-in from everyone in this room to support the network, both clinical and scientific, to develop this and grow this further.
Thank you, Tim. Right, so as Tim said, we had a webinar, which was towards the end of January, off the back of the baseline survey that we did. From the survey, as Tim's already said, we knew that there was a lot of interest and we thought engagement would be high, but I think it's fair to say this exceeded our expectations. We had more than 50 people on the call. I think we had representation from the vast majority of flow labs in the country that are associated with the HMDS, so that was absolutely fantastic. I think Tim and I felt very strongly that we shouldn't just interpret the results of the survey ourselves and come to this webinar with a set of actions that Tim and I had come up with. We really feel this has to be everybody's network, and we wanted everyone to feel like they could feed into what we did next. So the webinar, essentially, we used some online live polls during the webinar to try and get a bit more information about some of the data that we got from the survey already. So as Tim said, the sort of what do you want from the network questions highlighted standardisation and best practice and collaboration and peer support as the top two. So we tried to dig a little bit more into the detail of exactly what people were. I think it's very difficult when you're answering survey questions to always know exactly where the questioner is coming from and what response you should use. So we tried to dig a little bit more into the detail of what people were had in their heads when they responded to those questions. So we asked essentially what people took to mean as standardisation and best practice and what the themes were that they were thinking about when they were answering those questions. Obviously, quality and consistency came out really strongly. There was the best practice standards and obviously key to all our function, the patients. And we then talked a little bit more about how we'd apply that standardisation, where the people thought that we should look at specific assays and look through the whole process of the assay and standardise in that way, or whether people thought splitting out the sort of more wet, sort of technical aspects of an assay and the reporting aspects of an assay. But the vast majority on the call thought that we should look at all elements of a specific assay and approach standardisation in that way. The other question we asked was what priorities there were in terms of assays that centres are currently offering or wanting to develop. And MRD assays, unsurprisingly, came out really strongly in answer to that question. So in terms of best practice priorities, we then broke that down further into looking at things like panel design, validation and verification. They were the two that people showed the greatest amounts of interest in taking forwards. And then in terms of the reporting analytical side, looking at analytical strategies, but that wasn't as far ahead as the panel design on the wet side, a bit more of a mixed spread with reporting content and looking at more detail about limit of detection and limit of quantification for MRD in there as well. So we've already touched on this, but we asked about priority assays, and as I say, MRD came out very strongly. Myeloma is quite big in there, unsurprisingly, as there's sort of national changes potentially coming in terms of MRD-directed therapy. Lots of mentions of myeloid in there as well, which I think is a bit of a tricky process for quite a few of us in terms of MRD by flow at the moment. And then we wanted to try and get out of people what the network could offer in terms of training opportunities. So workshops come out quite strongly in here, but we did have quite a lot of discussion on the call about opportunities to visit other labs, peer support virtually, all that kind of thing. So that was really positive. So Tim's already alluded to this a little bit. I think there's a lot of actions that we could pull out of this and just make a big long list of projects and work streams. And I think we're very aware that no one has lots of time. And we wanted to sort of try and build this up steadily and make it a bit more sustainable. So, as Tim's already mentioned, we did ask how connected flow labs currently feel to other flow labs. And the answer was quite mixed, but as Tim said, quite worrying for some of the labs. So we've got the majority of labs responding that they had only limited connection with other flow labs in the UK. The minority were the ones who were saying they felt very connected or reasonably connected. So obviously that's something that a network which is inclusive and includes everyone can really help to improve. Obviously we want to continue to collaborate with the wider group of people that we've now managed to bring together and share as much best practice and knowledge as we can. So this was just a list really of all the different aspects of the service that we took from the original survey results as areas which we could look at doing some work in. It's quite wide-ranging, obviously. Some of this came out more strongly than others. So, as we've said, the standardisation and harmonisation thing, really the strongest in the webinar, but there's lots of other opportunities. Tim's already mentioned workforce and progression. There's, Ash has mentioned IT and LIMS, and a few other people have mentioned that as well. So I think there's lots of opportunity for this network beyond the initial conversations that we've had. So we asked a question about which areas of people's service they felt would most benefit from increased UK collaboration. Again, similar themes coming out to some of the earlier questions. Panel design, there's BCP in there, which I think it would be really good to get some discussion going about some sort of national BCP that we could, develop so that we're not all relying on the larger labs for that. So, as we've said, I think the key to progress is really to build some solid foundations, with the conversations we've already had being the starting point for that. It was great to see a lot of the smaller UK labs who wouldn't ordinarily necessarily get the opportunity to attend some of these meetings on that call. And we really want to keep engagement with everyone. I think it would be good to solidify that and keep the conversation going, and try and give some confidence to everyone in that space before we necessarily start digging into, really big work streams and things. But I think there's some initial actions that we can definitely take. So in the webinar, we presented this as well, but there has been a paper which Alan, who's in the room, was involved with, an international paper which looked at flow labs predominantly in the US to assess their workload, their working patterns, staffing, all those kind of things. If you look at the main themes in that paper, they're actually very similar to what came out of the survey in the webinar that we've already done. And there was agreement on the call that to sort of recapitulate this in a UK setting would be really useful. I think in terms of things we've already talked about, like how do you benchmark how much work a department can do or a single flow cytometrist can do, or but a lot of this data could feed into workforce planning and potentially, broader conversations about how departments are financed and things. So, just to summarise, so we've done the first part because we've formally fed back to you today about the survey and the webinar. As Tim says, the plan then will be to pull that into a bit more of a formal document that we can circulate to everyone. To keep the conversation going is key, I think. We need to really strengthen those links that we've started to make. We did ask in the webinar how frequently people would want to sort of get together, and so we've planned moving forwards hopefully to meet quarterly in a virtual way and just keep the conversation going. At our next meeting with the wider network, we'll hopefully be able to agree some further priorities and some realistic goals. But as I say, the first aim would be to try and recapitulate that survey that the ICCS did. There's obviously opportunity to work with lots of other partners once this network's established. There has been activity in the last 6 months or so in terms of other conversations happening about very similar content. So there was a meeting towards the end of last year in Leeds, predominantly from a PNH and CLL perspective, which a lot of you in the room were at. There's also, as I say, things happening in the myeloma space, which may mean that we're heading towards MRD guided therapy. And J&J, the company that are pushing that NICE submission, we're having discussions with them about supporting MRD workshops and sort of training and learning to make that technique a bit more established nationally. Yeah, I think Tim and I sort of feel slow and steady wins the race, so we're not going to dive in with lots and lots of different work streams, but I think, you know, we just want feedback from you all and we'll try and keep it moving. And I think that's it. Thank you. I don't know how we're doing for time.
I'm afraid you've got time for several questions. So,
it's all right, good.
So please, any questions from the audience? Any comments?
Yes, thanks very much. Question, is there any discussion in the network about if there's a feeling that certain specialised tests should be centralised to particular areas, or there's a feeling that, for example, myeloma MRD, AML MRD should be a sort of something that most HMDSs do?
So we haven't got into the nitty-gritty of that detail. I think that will definitely come as we have this conversation about the Perseus protocol and how that gets embedded into clinical practice. And yeah, I think like Tim said, it would be really good for us all to have some sort of agreed like competency framework and you know where you need to get to be able to implement an assay successfully and all that kind of thing. But yeah, they're definitely the kinds of conversations that we're wanting to have.
I think this is great, and collaboration is always a good thing. And obviously, everyone in theory wants everything to be standardized and best practice. But how do you think you will determine what best practice is? Because presumably everyone thinks theirs is the best practice. And do you think labs will actually change?
Might let Tim take that one. No, I think it's a valid question. I think those of us that have worked on, well, whether you call it standardisation or harmonisation and what the difference is between the two, I think they can be quite challenging projects. I would just hope that the more we all talk to each other and the more we trust each other, that will sort of come with time, a lot of that. I think sort of trying to jump in at the very beginning and say, this is the assay everybody has to use for myeloma MRD is not going to work. So it's just sort of building that over time, I think. And there's sort of degrees by which you can harmonise before you get to actually everybody doing exactly the same thing. So.
Can I comment on that question as well? I just want to reflect that there's not a lot of people asking that question just an hour ago when we talked about standardising integrated reporting. Why is that? And I think, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it is possible to do it, whether it's integrated reporting or flow or genetics, or even, dare I say it, histopathology.
So that is a good question and a challenge. And I think I'll ask John to comment, but I think there's less harmonisation, standardisation in integrated reporting compared to flow because we're much not as far along that journey. What we need to do is map out the landscape, which is what John and Ash and other people are doing, so we can start those conversations. I feel like flow's a bit further along that journey, but there's every time you answer a question, you ask more. So I don't know if, John, you want to comment because you're the one we've asked to think about this.
Yeah, I think certainly for integrated reporting, and I appreciate flow labs and integrated reports have a different level of challenge or complexity, which is fairly individual. But I think, yes, it's a problem because most of our integrated reports are grown up from the constraints we operate on, staffing, IT, structure. So it's difficult to be absolutely definitive about what a report should look like, but I think we could certainly maybe learn from best practice and move towards that direction. But I don't think we're ever going to be able to mandate something, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately. Variety is always nice.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, Ruth and Tim, and also Ulrika for all the efforts to bring the flow cytometry, UK flow cytometry community together and try to reach that, you know, aspirational standardization, but I think that probably if we put the effort on a training scheme, that then would be much easier to actually achieve. So I think it's what you mentioned about that is super important, yeah.
Hi, brilliant talk, and it's lovely to see you getting a network together. It seems there's a big gap where training is concerned, with no formal training program. Over the years, the complexity of flow cytometry has increased in response to numerous new therapies. Do you think there's any chance of a professional body opening up a training program for flow cytometry?
So, I mean, I already alluded to the IBMS used to have a portfolio. I think it's a big shame they got rid of it, because at least it was something that we could use. So what I'm hoping is that people passionate about training the future us's in the room will get together, and I've still got an old copy of the IBMS one. If we can rip it off or sort of recapitulate what they've done and develop it further to modern practice, because obviously it's a bit outdated now, but actually trying to make it more applicable to what we're doing now, but also what we're going to anticipate for the next 5-10 years.
Thanks, Tim.
So just to kind of highlight that, there are international qualifications which you can do in flow. There's an ESCA one and there's an ICCS one. So these exist, it's just people don't necessarily know about them. And I think the first problem with that is, in the UK especially, we're terrible at staying in contact with each other. There's some people in the room that I have only met once in this country, but I've met at overseas meetings. So I think, and that's genuine, there's someone I met about 3 or 4 times before I met him in the UK. So I think there are resources out there, there are certifications, there are qualifications, but I think the training and all of these things can develop better if we start getting some level of harmonization or standardization, because there are labs in this country still running 3-color flow, and there are labs that are running 25-color flow, all in a clinical setting. And you can't train someone who's doing 2-color flow and how to do that. It's like a leap. So I think that kind of people knowing each other, learning, using the resources that are already out there is the first step to move towards that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is your network. This is everyone who wants to be part of it owns a bit of that network, and it's only through communication that we're going to achieve anything.
I think the complexity on the training as well is related to what's been already alluded to, that all our services are different, and I think some services will want somebody who's sort of cross-trained in haematology and flow. Some people will just want a flow cytometrist, so we sort of need to factor all that in as well when we're trying to come up with a training plan.
That's really great. Now, the best way to get people talking to each other is to give them food. So thank you very much, and please go forth and eat. It's a plant-based diet, so in the interest of sustainability. And just as a last note, I forgot to mention at the beginning, if you haven't signed in yet, we need to, if you just sign in, make sure your name's registered so we know who's actually arrived and come.
And whoever ordered gluten-free and any special dietary requirements, if you could go to the, tell the servers, because they've got a special meal for you behind the catering area.
Sorry, just one last thing. If there are any flow cytometrists going to the BSH, it'd be good to have a good old knees up in a pub or some other establishment. So we'll try and get something, we'll put it on the network to meet up and discuss things over a sober drink or two.